Where are you in a dominance hierarchy? Because one of the things your brain is trying to understand is, how should you regard yourself as an active and competent organism when you're facing problems that you can't compute? And the answer to that is, we're not going to solve that. We're going to distribute the problem into the social network, and we're going to let everyone else solve it. And so if you rise up in the dominance hierarchy, your brain reacts as if the dominance hierarchy structure, which is composed of many, many brains, has run its computations and decided that you're pretty damn competent. And so the way your brain responds to that is it cranks up your serotonin production and it decreases your neuroticism. And it's perfectly reasonable computation because A, if everybody says you're competent enough so that you're going to get more rewarded for your competence than other people are. And that's going to make you more secure in your job. It's going to make you more desirable and in demand among other people. And that's going to give you access to resources you wouldn't otherwise have. So, and then there's a correlated element to that, which is sort of your level of self-esteem, although that's very much associated with neuroticism. People with high self-esteem generally have low levels of negative emotion. It's not clear that those are separable phenomena. Well, let's say you want to have the first question is, can you have a meaningful life? Right? Because we're going to start from the proposition that unvarnished life is very dismal and dreadful, right? So if you're not prepared for it, it'll just grind you up, and that will be very painful. Okay, so we're going to use that as a baseline. The baseline isn't that you're going to be secure and happy. The baseline is, there isn't much of you, you're very fragile, and things will grind you into nothing. That's a Buddhist stance, right? Because the Buddhists say, first dictum of Buddhism is, life is suffering. The first dictum isn't that life is happy. So the Buddhists basically say, chaos is the normative condition. Okay, so fine. So how do you do that? How do you deal with that? It's not how you fight against it or defend against it. I don't think those are appropriate conceptualizations. It's not positive illusions, it's not defense mechanisms, it's none of that, although you may also use that. What it is, do you have an intimate relationship that works? Do you have a family that's networked well together and strong? Do you have some sort of interesting occupation that regularizes your schedule, gives you something productive to do on a long-term basis, is stable and productive, right? Do you have something that you find engaging to do, or maybe more than one thing outside of work, right? And are you compromising your mental and physical health by doing any things that are particularly stupid? And, you know, one of those the top one of those I would say is probably alcoholism. So if there's one thing you really want to avoid that screws up your life, it's drinking too much. It is unbelievably dangerous. So the first thing we might say is, well, let's optimize those. Well, the more you optimize those, the more pillars there are in your plan. And they're only somewhat correlated. So maybe you can lose one, or maybe you can even lose two. It's going to knock you down, but it's not going to sink you. You know, and then you might also want to have variance on those plans to some degree. So like one of the things I mentioned earlier is that it's always nice to have an alternative to your current job at hand, because it stops you from being vulnerable. It also stops you from being a slave or a victim, or maybe even stops you from being a tyrant, because you've got some choice. So you diversify your hierarchy of plans, essentially. Just like you do, you can think about it as stock market investing in some sense. It's a very analogous idea. You don't put all your eggs in the same basket. You diversify across multiple portfolios. So if one sector gets knocked out, hopefully it doesn't knock you completely out of the game. And that's partly what I guide you through in the future authoring program too, because it asks you to consider what I think are the main 6 dimensions of your life. You know, and so one of the things I do when a client comes is I just do a rough walkthrough of those dimensions. It's like, does anybody care if you're alive or dead? You know, so do you have any friends? Do you have anybody that loves you? Do you have an intimate relationship? How are things going with your family? Do you have a job? Are you as educated as you are intelligent? Do you have any room for advancement in the future? Do you do anything interesting outside of your job? And if the answer to all those is no, it's like, you're not depressed, my friend. You just are screwed. Really, it's like if someone comes to me and they're 40 and that's the issue, especially if they're also drinking, it's like Humpty Dumpty has hit the floor and no one is going to put the pieces together because it's too much. It's too much. People, you know what I mean? It takes a whole lifetime to put those things together. And that might have started as a psychological problem. But by the time it's fully manifest and you're 40, that's not a psychological problem. It's just a complete catastrophe.
So, someone in that situation at 40, what is the best thing for them to do?
Well, I think sometimes antidepressants help. And the reason they help is because they actually buffer the stress response. So, you know, you're being ground down by the world. Because essentially what you are is you're not even in a dominance hierarchy. You're so low in the dominance hierarchy that you're not even in it, right? You're an outcast, fundamentally. So maybe buffering the stress response will help the person just not die from that. And then you start with one thing. You know, it's like you lay out the potential areas for improvement on the table and you say, well, can we think of some small steps that you might take in one or more of those domains to start putting something solid underneath your feet. But what happens, I think, is that as you lose those pillars, the way that problems manifest themselves in your life becomes networked. And so you might make progress here, but some other catastrophe that's looming over here is going to knock you down. You know, so, yeah. No, it means that you're better protected against being dreadfully miserable and swamped than you would otherwise be. So I would say you have to do those things before you can even address the issue of being happy. Right? Because if you haven't established yourself in one or two of those domains, say, there's some obvious things that you could do to decrease the degree to which your life is negative that you haven't yet done. So I would say you shouldn't even get to the existential problem before you've solved the practical problems. And you may find that if you solved the practical problems, the existential problems would become bearable. Now, not necessarily. You know, because I might say, well, there's another class of people, and I would say this is one of the pathologies of being creative. So if you're a high open person, and you have all those things, that's not going to be enough. You're going to have to pick another domain where you're working on something that's positive and somewhat revolutionary. Because like the creative impulse is, for someone who's open, we know it's a fundamental personality dimension, and I have clients who are very high in openness and others who aren't. And if the ones who are high in openness aren't doing something creative, then they're like dead sticks. They can't live properly. So you know that. And I think those are the people, for example, who benefit particularly from depth psychological approaches, especially Jungian approaches. I think that all of Jung's clients were high in openness. Because I've watched my clients, I'll try Jungian ideas out on them, and if they're high in openness, they work like a charm. It just fits right in with their psyche. But if they're conservative people, fundamentally conservative people, low in openness and high in conscientiousness, it just doesn't click. Because the Jungian approach is aesthetic and creative, and lots of people aren't either of those things. So, there was another question? Yes?
I was just going to ask, can you be high in conscientiousness and high in openness?
Yeah, but they fight.
Yeah.
Especially if you're orderly. Yeah. You know, because conscientiousness is partly orderliness and partly openness. Hitler was like that. He was extremely orderly and extremely high in openness. And one of the ways he solved that problem, which was quite interesting, is that whenever there were art exhibitions in Nazi Germany, there were two types. There was the approved Nazi art, which was very structured and conventional, and you know, bordered on the propagandistic. And there was forbidden art, which was really chaotic, and like often it was the expressionist stuff, for example, which is really emotionally expressive, but chaotic. And Hitler would have both exhibitions going on at the same time, and one of them would be forbidden and the other would be approved, you know. So, but the problem with orderliness is that you want everything to be in its category, and no wonder. We've described why that is. But if you're open, you're always thinking, well, maybe there's a better way of putting those things in a category. And that's tough. So orderly, open people are always at odds with themselves, you know, so.
I think it's like a common personality type of be like high in conscientiousness because you're really industrious, and then high in openness because you're open. But like not necessarily, like I can see why the orderly thing would be, but I just noticed that's like a personality type.
Yeah.
Be really industrious and also really open.
Yeah, well, people like that are often extremely successful.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And it looks like industriousness is the part of conscientiousness that predicts long-term life success, and orderliness is the part that predicts conservative political attitudes. But low openness is also associated with conservative political attitudes.